How did a black man during slavery avenge the abuse and rape of his wife by her white master? There is no worse time for a man who has to work hard on his master's fertile lands, growing tobacco, rice and cotton under surveillance by white men riding horses, constantly listening bad words and the sound of the whip every time you show fatigue and sweating under a sun that burns every part of your black skin, due to the intensity of the sun's rays that burn his spirit as an enslaved man. On top of all that gloom, you must accept that your woman's body belongs to another man who possesses her every time he is craving for affection, because her husband, as a black man enslaved just like her, don't dare to face it. During slavery, in the agricultural fields of the southern plantations, the enslaved black man who defied his owner was a dead man, no matter how cruel the master was to his slave. One of the great stories during slavery is centered on the exploitation and use of the black woman's body on the plantations, working alongside her husband and children, but also as part of the servants in the big house, who had to sleep in the kitchen, the chicken coops and the horse stable. But the worst of all this, it was the abuse, harassment and rape of black women enslaved against their will, which I could tell you is the main plot of the story I'm telling you right now. Story which is based on the life of a black slave named Murphy, 25 years old, and his wife, whose name is Barbara, 22 years old, who works in the big house on one of the largest plantations in South Carolina, along the river near the city of Charleston during slavery. A black woman, abused by her master and forced to please her lowest needs in everything he wanted as a man, without caring that it was a morally forbidden relationship, but also because she was a woman who had her husband, in the same way that he had his wife. But even though Murphy's wife Barbara was a forbidden woman, he did not care because he, as a lord and slave owner, had the power to do with his belonging to her whatever he wanted from her, even making love to her, even though she opposed this so inhuman and barbaric. Raping her body and destroying her self-esteem of a black woman like Barbara, at the same time also challenging Murphy's manhood. We all know that during slavery, when an owner of slave made love to the woman, who was the wife of a slave, there was not much this black man could do. The name of this man with such a bad soul, whose words immorality and decency were not part of his vocabulary, much less his behavior, was known. The name of this evil slave-owning man was Jeffrey, who was 38 years old, married to a white woman named Linda. Between them they had 4 female girls whose age ranged between 7 and 12 years old. Jeffrey owned one of the largest plantations in the entire region. A white man, rich and influential in the southern British colonies, but above all extremely powerful, reasons by which everyone knew, including the most important elite group of the slave society, of the atrocities, abuses and mistreatment committed against the population enslaved from their property, and let's not talk about the exploitation that the body of women was subjected to whom, apart from giving birth to enslaved children, they also had to satisfy the most intimate desires of his owner, a white man who imposes his desire on all the enslaved black women who caught his attention, to satisfy his most intimate needs. Some inside and outside the plantation commented with some irony that God only gave him female children as punishment for the abuses he committed against the black women who are their property, as a form of punishment by depriving him of a firstborn son as the future boss and owner of the plantation, which he blamed on his white wife for not giving him a male child. Within the enslaved population on the plantation there was an open secret that Jeff, owner of the slaves, was the father biological birth of several mulatto children, who had been the result of extramarital relations with enslaved black women of his property. Some were males and others were females, which was an irony, but also the secret mockery, according to comments inside and outside the plantation, that their only male children were mulattoes. This black women slave, mothers of those children, were forbidden to speak about the real father of those mulatto children, who did not know the name of their true father, and in some cases the husbands of these black women who were lovers of his master, had to treat and accept him as their own children. Type of humiliation that Murphy, Barbara's husband, would not be willing to accept from Jeff, a slave-owning white man, who was considered one of the most powerful people and term among all plantation owners in South Carolina during slavery. It was an open secret among the enslaved population that Jeff was sick, sexually harassing women, and even more so when that black woman was beautiful and intelligent, but above all young as Barbara was, Murphy's wife, a young girl who worked as part of the servants in the big house under the constant sight of Jeff, who, although he was married to Linda, a white woman, what he thought about her husband's harassment of black women was not something she cared about, situation which created some nervousness for Murphy, since his wife could be being harassed by his owner and he would not know what to do if his wife Barbara was suffering sexual harassment from her master. But, that day that everyone knew would come, a bad event happened, that everyone knew was going to happen sooner or later, which changed the life of Barbara, Murphy's wife, and Jeffrey, owner of the plantation, when one morning, in the early hours before dawn, Barbara was raped by Jeffrey on top of the chicken coop when she left the kitchen to look for fresh eggs to prepare breakfast for her white master's daughters, owner of the big house. That day, like any other, in which Jeff entered the kitchen to make his coffee, although all the servants knew that it was an excuse to sexually harass Barbara in front of the servants, who for fear of their master kept their mouths shut, especially when you work as a maid in the big house, which was a privilege that none of them wanted to lose. Jeffrey noticed Barbara's absence in the kitchen at that time and asked where she was, to which one of the cooks told him that she had gone to get fresh eggs in the chicken coop, which was in the back inside the stable horse where the chickens were. When Jeffrey heard that from the maid, he remained silent, showing that satisfied smile that everyone knows when someone is thinking about doing something they have wanted to do for some time, and the presence of Barbara alone in the chicken coop, that woman so desired by Jeffrey, the black man Murphy's wife, was the perfect opportunity that he had to possess her as a woman, without the presence of witnesses, of such a shameful action by a white man against a black woman owned by him. Jeffrey left the house using the back door of the big house and headed towards the horse stable where the chicken coop was, and under the darkness of the early in the morning he raped Barbara upstairs in the stable. The black Barbara did everything possible to avoid being abused by her white master, screaming with all her strength to avoid being raped. Barbara tried to escape from the arms of her white master, pushing him, kicking him, hitting him in the chest again and again. But the worst thing she did, unleashing Jeffrey's wrath, was when Barbara scratched his face, causing him to hit her, making her unconscious for a moment, which Jeffrey took advantage of to rape the black woman Barbara in the chicken coop on a cold and dark morning, under the unheard screams of a black woman whom no one knew about. Such a cowardly and immoral act that her owner was doing at that moment, to a woman whose only sin was being beautiful, after everything had happened. When Barbara realized what had happened to her, at the hands of her master, she cried inconsolably for having been part of such a degrading, humiliating and heartbreaking for dignity when you, as a woman, are forced against her will, where your body was raped by a white man who owned her, making her feel like an object which belonged to him and she could do what he wanted. Barbara, apart from feeling like a violated woman, also felt guilty and dirty for allowed her master to abuse her. Jeffrey, after satisfying his most primitive needs that every out-of-control man has, after he finished pulling up his pants and tying his leash, she told him in an aggressive tone, "I hope, for the life of your husband, that what happened between you and me, stays in this chicken coop, where women like you must always be." Barbara, crying inconsolably for what had happened, left the chicken coop where she was raped by her owner. She, walking slowly, entered through the back door where the kitchen of the big house was. With a lost and trembling look, she sat on a chair away from the other maids who were preparing the breakfasts for her master's family. Some of them noticed the calm behavior of Barbara, a cheerful girl, then looked at the blow on Barbara's face and her disheveled dress. The questions were unnecessary, because they all knew what had happened, that Jeffrey, her owner and lord of her, had raped her in the corral of the horses where the chicken coop was. One of them heated a warm cloth to clean the wound of the bumps and bruises, and between cries and sobs she hugged her. Barbara, trying to comfort her at such a difficult time in her life after being abused by Jeffrey. But all the other women in the kitchen knew that the biggest mistake Barbara made was being an extremely beautiful and attractive black woman on a plantation of a white man without the slightest scruples about her, who abused black women, using her and treating her as an object of pleasure every time he wanted it, not caring if she wanted it or not, because for Jeffrey the slaves did not have the right to have their own thoughts or feelings, because they only had three options: listen, obey and work. Have no doubt, during slavery the slave owner had enormous power over the enslaved men and women. Challenging the power of the owner, slaves ended in painful punishment using a whip, which sometimes cut the fresh skin of the back, producing wounds that lasted months to heal and left scars for life, leaving scars which sometimes lowered the price of slaves on the slave market, because they were considered sign of being unruly and disobedient to the orders of his master. But the worst punishment was the castration of the slave, the separation of the black women from the children. Also as punishment was the sale of the slaves at auctions, or put them to work in hard, dangerous and inhuman work all the time. In some cases, with little water to drink, eating what they found around them and letting him sleep naked outdoors under the constant itching of mosquitoes and the intense cold during the freezing winter nights. Maybe that's why some black men raped black women and the witnesses of that rape, but above all the husband of a black woman abused by her master, kept his mouth shut. But one of the characteristics of all Southern plantations is that the truth of what happened to Barbara, an enslaved woman who worked as a servant in the big house, a type of event that changed the life of a woman whose only flaw is being young and beautiful during slavery, awakening desires uncontrollable of her white master, was a type of story that would be told in the barracks where most of the slaves slept and lived. Secret, which grew as gunpowder among the slaves, producing indignation, repudiation and hatred towards Jeffrey, owner of the plantation, who had raped a black slave on his property. You can't imagine how Murphy felt when he found out that his wife Barbara had been abused and raped by her white master, the owner and lord of the plantation. What was Murphy's reaction when he found out that her wife was abused by her owner in the chicken coop of the big house one morning, when she went out to look for fresh eggs to prepare breakfast for her master's daughters? Some could say that it is the most crucial moment in this story, the one that changed Barbara's life, the black girl raped by her master, who despite being her owner, master and lord, was disowned by everyone for having abused a black woman who was part of the servitude in the big house. But above all, it also changed the life of Murphy, Barbara's husband, who as a result of the harassment and sexual abuse of his wife by his white owner, he made the worst mistake of his life, whether out of jealousy or revenge. And let's not talk about rage as a man when he felt humiliated and challenged by a white man, who dared to abuse his wife one dark morning in a place where the only witnesses were the horses and the laying hens. Murphy, in response to this diabolical, criminal, immoral and shameful behavior of his white master against a black woman, whose only crime was to lift the uncontrollable passion of his master, who wanted to possess her, even if it were by force, committed an act never heard of during slavery. The story of a black slave who killed her owner, avenging the emotional and physical abuse that her master committed against a woman when he raped her against her will before her eyes from everyone, because he saw her and treated her, not as a person, but as a woman who owned her own life and emotions, and treated her like property. Kind of man without scruples, who despite all the wealth and power, owner of slaves, who could dispose and do with that slave whatever he wanted, for because of the laws of ownership of slaves during slavery, as her master, owner of her and lord of her, she belonged to him regardless of whether this enslaved woman had her husband or not. But despite how Murphy felt, when he found out about his wife's rape, he behaved like all black men in the past, whose wives they were raped by his white master. Murphy remained silent, as if nothing had happened. But those who knew him knew that somehow he was going to avenge his wife Barbara's rape, Murphy was not the type of black slave submissive by nature, which was a product of fear of punishment from his owner. One afternoon in the rice fields after a rainy day, what everyone feared could happen happened. Despite Murphy's silence at one point of carelessness when his master crossed next to him, when Murphy was working in the wet and muddy land of harvesting rice, Murphy walked slowly towards his owner with a submissive attitude and behavior towards his master to gain the trust that everything was fine. Towards the man who months ago had raped his wife, Murphy took the knife, modified by him, to use it in his revenge at the opportune moment for raping his wife, that he used to cut the rice branches and stabbed the most sensitive parts of the horse, which his master Jeff was riding at that moment. As Murphy expected, as a result of the painful stab wound to the horse that his master Jeffrey was riding, using a sickle-type knife, he stabbed it several times. The horse neighed in a cry of pain. He raised his front legs and threw Jeffrey towards the wet, muddy ground, smearing him with mud from his fall. Jeffrey, as way to intimidate him, she grabbed his whip and several times threw it at Murphy as a sign that he was in control. But Murphy grabbed the whip from his master so as not to be punished for what he had done, and with the same whip in hand he approached his master Jeffrey, and without saying a word, he stabbed him again and again with the knife, cutting rice, shouting loudly, "As a man, I do not forgive you for raping my wife Barbara. That is why you deserve death." Jeffrey, after receiving several stabs in the chest and stomach, with bleeding wounds, shouted loudly, "You disgraceful black man, for what he is doing to you. I will kill you and your wife and every member of your family, you damned nigger." Everything happened so quickly that the other slaves were stunned by what was happening. When listening to the cries of begging of a white master, to avoid being killed by the edge of the rice-cutting knife, before the anger of a black man, like Murphy, who was accusing his master for the abuses he was accustomed to committing against black women on the plantation. Many slaves who were cutting and gathering rice at that time, when they saw the lifeless body of their master in Murphy's hand, surrounded him and began to mourning the death of white master. Some looked at Murphy with contempt and despair for having killed his owner and lord of the big house in one of the largest slave plantations in the southern United States, as was the case in the state of South Carolina. History that everyone knows, but very little they tell, for fear of retaliation by white men against black slaves who dare to challenge their power. But one thing is what people said about the great power that white people have during slavery in the British colonies in the South, and another thing is the determination of a black man like Murphy, when he made the decision to avenge the abuse committed by the white owner of his wife Barbara, by killing him with a chopping knife that he had modified to cause the greatest possible damage to the body of his master Jeffrey, who dared to put his filthy hands on his wife one cold morning dark in the stable of the big house. When some black slaves saw his master die from Murphy's attack, they tried to beat Murphy, angry at the attack death of his white master, while other black slaves protected Murphy from the mob of slaves who wished to avenge the death. Given the shock of what was happening, some white foremen arrived mounted on their horses, and when they looked at Jeffrey's motionless body covered in mud and bloody from the wounds inflicted by the slave Murphy, who still had the knife in his hand trying to defend himself from the black slaves who wanted to avenge the death of Master White. Several of the horse-mounted white taskmaster began to punish Murphy with the whips, managing to take away the knife that he had in hand. One of the taskmaster dismounted from the horse and tied Murphy by the feet and, getting on his horse, dragged Murphy over the wet and muddy lands, planted with rice, where you could hear the screams of a black slave who dared to kill his white master for having raped his wife. But despite the whips and beatings from other black slaves, Murphy survived the beating he was subjected to. As punishment, almost left for dead, Murphy was tied to a dawn branch with a rope tied around his neck, which made it difficult for him to breathe. They pulled the rope, leaving hanging his feet touching the ground with his toes, a type of punishment imposed by the white foreman, hoping that Murphy would hang himself with his own weight as a result of the fatigue and the wounds of the whips. During those moments of agony, when you know he's just a few steps away from dying, Murphy looked up at the black sky full of bright star and he apologized to Barbara for having failed him as a man and to protect her from the abuse of her master who targeted her at that time when she no longer had any strength in her. I heard his body. I heard the silent footsteps in the darkness of the night, when suddenly the hands and arms of a woman lifted Murphy's body and cut the rope that is around his neck, falling fainting due to lack of energy. After Murphy was lying in the dirt and wet leaves beneath him, in a soft tone, Barbara whispered in Murphy's ear, "My love, please, don't die, because if you die I die too." Several black women in the darkness of night under a thick fog believing that Murphy had died by hanging himself, they decided to help Barbara save or search for her husband's body from what was certain death. But Murphy's desire to live was so great that Barbara, accompanied by other slave women, they arrived in time to save his life. The black slave women took a horse from behind the plantation bushes, which they brought to carry Murphy's body in case there was dead. One of them hugged Barbara as a sign of goodbye. They put Murphy on the horse's saddle, hugging his wife Barbara's back, saying in a low voice, "Ride north and seek your freedom." Barbara crying through tears for the opportunity that her life was giving her again and for the bravery of several black women who dared to help a black slave woman in the most difficult moment of her life and the man she loved with all her heart, a well-known black man like Murphy, who avenged the abuse and rape of his white master against his wife. Barbara and Murphy, under a dark night, rode a horse heading towards the northern lands where they could live in freedom and more at a time when the British colonies in America began to seek their independence from the English crown. Ladies and gentlemen, did you come this far? Thank you very much for listening to this fascinating and emotional story during slavery in the United States. How the story really ended, of Murphy, a black slave who avenged the abuse of his wife Barbara by his white master. You will know that answer in another video in this same channel where we will tell the final chapter of this fascinating drama. Once again, thank you very much for your support and attention by visiting this channel and listening to this kind of story never told until this moment.